Reflections of love. To build up one another, we must demonstrate Christ's love in all of our relationships. Here's Gene.
In our last principle, I actually left you with a question that I call a reflection and response question. And in essence, here it is. How does Paul demonstrate that the Corinthians' spiritual gifts were not a sign of their spiritual maturity? Now, in order to answer that question and to get the flow in Paul's letter, we need to review. So let's go back to the beginning of chapter 13. He said this, they have gifts without love. Because he said, Corinthians, if I speak human or angelic tongues, like they did, we know that from the previous chapter, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now that's an indictment. He goes on to say, if I have the gift of prophecy, and they did, and understand all mysteries, and they did, and all knowledge, and they had those gifts, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains but do not have love, I'm nothing. And then he goes on to sort of put the nail in the coffin, as it were, in terms of their behavior. He says, and if I give away all my possessions, even if I give away everything, and if I give over my body in order to boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Now, if you were a Corinthian, and this letter was being read, and you are unspiritual, and you are carnal, and you're living in the flesh, like Paul said you were, at least most of them, there were exceptions, what would be happening to you? I think the hair would be rising on the back of their necks. And they'd be saying, Paul, we don't believe you. We've rejected you anyway. Someone would say, what do you mean, Paul, that we don't have any love? Well, Paul anticipates that question. And he, in essence, is saying, I know that you're wondering why I said that you don't have love, in spite of all of your gifts. He said, let me tell you, I've already told you, but I'm going to tell you again. And this is amazing to me, because notice what he does. He says, I'll tell you how you don't have any love. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy. And in chapter 3, verse 3, they were impatient, unkind, and envious. He had already told them. And so he took them back to what he wrote. He goes on to say, love is not boastful, is not arrogant. And then he takes them back to chapter 3 and chapter 4. They were boastful and arrogant. You see what Paul's doing? He's going back and reviewing everything he said to demonstrate to them why he knows they lack love. He goes on to say, chapter 13, verse 5a, love is not rude, not self-seeking. They were rude and self-seeking. Remember the Lord's Supper? They were coming, eating all the food. They were drinking the wine. They were getting drunk. That's the ultimate in rudeness. And Paul said, that's how I know you don't have any love. Not the kind of love you should have. He goes on to say, love is not irritable, does not keep a record of wrongs. And in chapter 6, they were having public disputes in courts of law. That's when Paul, remember, said, isn't there one mature man among you who can solve your problems? He says, this is how I know you don't have any love. I've told you, I'm telling you again. He goes on to say, love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. They were actually approving immoral behavior and bragging about it. And Paul is making sure they get the message. He goes on to say, love bears all things. And they were causing weaker Christians to stumble. They were going to pagan idols, into pagan temples. They were buying meat that was offered. They were actually watching immoral activities. And weaker Christians within this group went back to their pagan way of not only buying the meat that was offered to idols, but engaging in the immorality that existed in Corinth. So Paul said, that's how I know you don't have any love. You have all the gifts, but you don't have love. He actually goes on to say, love believes all things, and some no longer trusted Paul. He actually had, as an apostle, to defend his apostleship to them, which we already looked at. So, within the space of these 4 verses, Paul demonstrated that the Corinthians had little, if any, love. If they were listening at all, they could not deny this indictment. So what is the reflection and response question? How does 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7 describe the fruit of the Holy Spirit in our Christian relationships? Well, the fruit of the Spirit is the opposite of what they were. They had the gifts of the Spirit, but not the fruit of the Spirit. And so Paul said in the Galatians, but the fruit of the Spirit is love. That is joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. The law is not against such things. So here Paul is addressing their immaturity, telling them, your focus is in the wrong place. Your focus should be to become like Jesus Christ, who loved us enough to give his life for us. So here's the principle to live by. To build up one another, we must demonstrate Christ's love in all of our relationships.